I'm 74 years old. It took me a long time to say it out loud, as if age was a confession I had been avoiding. For most of my life, I believed what I was told. I believed them when they said it was normal to give in, that it was just like that adapting was a sign of maturity. Today, I know it wasn't. It was silence. And I got very good at it. I learned early on that questioning was costly. Not money, but peace. And at that time, peace seemed all that mattered. So I agreed. I smiled. I swallowed. Each time I did this, I felt something in me shrink a little more, but I had no words to explain it. He just kept moving forward, because that was what was expected. I spent years confusing adaptation with love. I thought that to love was not to bother, not to demand, not to take up too much space. There was always someone more important, someone more tired, someone with a voice louder than mine. I adjusted. It molded me. It diminished me. And I told myself that everything was fine. No one ever asked me this directly. This is the cruelest detail. There were no explicit orders, only looks, silences, and expectations. I learned quickly. I learned to read environments better than people. He knew when to speak, and especially when to be silent. The problem is that this when has become always. Over time, I stopped noticing my own desires. When someone asked what I wanted, I froze. He answered anything, whichever was easier. Anything that didn't cause friction. And so I lived a functional life, but distant. Present, but absent from me. Today, sitting in this silent house, I realize how much this skill cost me. The house is still the same, but I'm not. Or maybe you were never who you thought you were. The walls hold memories that do not make noise, but weigh them down. Each object seems to know more about me than I know myself. I used to think that getting old was losing strength. Now I understand that in my case, it was realizing what I lost without noticing. I lost space. I lost my voice. I lost small choices that, added together, became an entire life lived on automatic. And no one noticed. Neither did I. There's a specific loneliness in discovering it late. It is not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of realizing that you have always been, surrounded by people, commitments, obligations, but alone within himself. I called it normality. It was easier that way. For a long time, I prided myself on being someone easy to deal with. "You don't give trouble," they said. I smiled. Today, this phrase echoes differently. I realized that being too easy meant being invisible, and that hurts more than I expected to admit. I don't write this to blame anyone. Each one did what they knew, what they could. But there are truths that only appear when the noise subsides. And now, with the silence of old age, they scream. They scream for recognition, by space, by existence. Perhaps it is still too late for many things. I don't deny that. But it's not too late to understand. And understanding changes everything, even if inside, even if no one sees it. For the first time, I feel like I'm starting to say something that has been stuck for decades. I don't know exactly where this story will go. I just know that I can no longer pretend that it doesn't exist. I spent decades adapting, and now, finally, I realize there was almost no space left, but the little that remained, it's still mine. The fact that you chose to stay here listening to this says a lot about who you are. What follows is not just my story. It's something that runs through a lot of people's lives, even when no one talks about it. If you believe that truths like this deserve to be told and continued, subscribe to the channel. Because these stories only exist as long as someone decides to listen to them. I was born into a home where almost everything was understood without being said. There were no big fights or exaggerated gestures, but there was an invisible rule that guided everything: don't make trouble. From an early age, I realized that there was a right way to be there, and this way did not include too many questions, too many emotions, or desires of their own. My mother was always tired. It was not a fatigue that passed with rest, but something deeper, accumulated. She did what needed to be done every day without complaining. I learned by observing that complaining didn't change anything. It just made things more difficult. So I also learned to endure in silence. My father was a man of few words. I didn't need to explain much. His gaze was enough to close any subject. I felt when I crossed a limit, even without knowing exactly what it was. This feeling of stepping on wrong ground accompanied me for a long time, and it taught me to back off before I even try. Our life was simple. The money was enough for what was necessary, but always with care. Nothing could be left. Neither food, nor time, nor feelings. Emotional displays seemed wasteful. I absorbed it without question. I began to think that feeling too much was a defect. When I made a mistake, the punishment did not come in the form of a scream. It came in heavy silence, invisible disappointment. That affected me deeply. So I started to anticipate myself. Before I even did something, I thought about whether it was worth it. Most of the time, it wasn't. At school, I was the well-behaved student, which did not draw attention. The teachers praised my calm manner. My colleagues rarely noticed me. I saw it as a positive thing. Being noticed seemed dangerous. Invisibility for me was security. At home, no one asked how I felt. And I didn't offer it either. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he didn't know anyone might be interested. I kept emotions like someone who keeps useless objects. Out of sight, but never out of weight. I learned early on that some people command and others obey, and I accepted my place without resistance. Not out of weakness, but out of survival. I believed that this was maturity, that growing up was learning to fit in. Decisions always came ready. About what was right, about what was expected of me, about the future. I just followed. When I tried to give an opinion, I noticed discomfort in the air. A silence that said, "This is not necessary." Over time, I began to be proud of it, to be easy, of not giving work, to understand without needing to be explained. That became part of who I was. I was the one who adapted, which did not complicate it, which he accepted. Today, looking back, I see that no one taught me to exist fully. They taught how to fit, decreasing, occupying only the space allowed. And I learned so well that I took it with me to all stages of life. That quiet boy just wanted security, and he found in silence a way to survive. The problem is that no one taught him when it was safe to stop hiding. It was there, in that seemingly ordinary childhood, that it all began. There was no major event. There was repetition, day after day. And sometimes that's what builds a whole life without us realizing it. The first concessions were so small that they hardly left a mark. There was no specific moment when I could say, "This is where it started." They were subtle, almost gentle adjustments that I made to avoid tension. I believed I was being reasonable. I didn't imagine that I was giving up on myself little by little. I remember simple choices, those that don't seem to matter. Someone decided something for me, and I accepted it. Not because I agreed, but because disagreeing seemed to require an emotional effort that I didn't know how to sustain. Defending one's own desire made me uncomfortable, as if I was doing something wrong. Whenever I thought about talking, a weight appeared in my chest, an old, familiar feeling. The reminder that talking too much could bring problems, so I anticipated myself. He retreated before even trying. It was easier that way, less risky. Over time, I began to confuse peace with the absence of conflict. If no one was complaining, I believed that everything was fine. I didn't realize that this peace was built at the expense of my silence, and the silence, little by little, began to turn into tiredness. There were times when something inside me revolted, a discreet but insistent discomfort, a desire to say, "It's not quite like that." But soon came the old logic. It's not worth it. Don't create problems. And I swallowed it once again. People around me began to count on it. With my ease in giving in, with my willingness to accept. "You are so understanding," they said. I smiled, feeling a strange mixture of pride and emptiness. That sounded like a compliment, but it left a bitter taste. Each concession seemed isolated, nothing big enough to justify greater discomfort. But internally, something was piling up, a constant feeling of always giving up, always being last. I still didn't call it a loss. I called it adaptation. Gradually, I lost the ability to distinguish what I wanted from what was most convenient for others. My answers became automatic. I often said whatever, and deep down, that was no longer true. There was a momentary relief in disappearing a little. When I didn't take up space, no one questioned me. When I didn't express wishes, no one was frustrated with me. This relief has become a dangerous, almost comfortable habit. I convinced myself that this was maturity, that insisting on wills was a sign of selfishness. I wanted to be easy. I accept. Dear. Even if it cost me something I couldn't name yet. The problem is that no one notices when they start to get lost. There is no warning, no clear signal. It is a slow, silent process. And exactly for this reason, so effective. When I realized it, I was already very distant from myself. Today, looking back, I see that those first concessions were training for something bigger, for longer silences, for deeper decisions made by others. I was learning to disappear, and I still thought that was living. There was a moment when the adaptation was no longer small. It was not announced nor dramatized. It just happened. An important decision was placed before me as something already settled. They didn't ask me what I wanted. They just explained to me why it was the best. I remember the conversation as if I were watching from the outside. The words came organized, logical, full of reasonable arguments. Everything made sense except the grip that grew inside me. I felt that something was being decided about my life without me actually participating. Someone said it was the safest way. Another reinforced that I needed to think about the good of all. There were even those who said I was lucky. I listened, nodded, and tried to ignore the feeling that I was being pushed into a place I didn't choose. At no time were there screams. This is what confuses me the most when I remember. Everything was calm, polite, almost careful, but that care did not include my wishes. It included only the expected result. And I learned that disagreeing there would mean being seen as a problem. When I tried to hesitate, I heard phrases that stuck with me. You've always been so understanding. Don't complicate it. That's how life works. Every word seemed to close a door inside me. I felt like talking, but I didn't know how. There was a silent fear of disappointing, a deep fear of breaking with the image they had of me. I was already known for accepting, for understanding, for not creating resistance. And at that moment, sustaining that image seemed more important than listening to me. So I agreed, not with conviction, but with fatigue. A fatigue that came from years of accumulated concessions. I said yes because saying no seemed impossible, because there was no room for doubt, because I had already learned what my role was. At that moment, something changed. Not in a visible way, but definitively. I felt as if I had retreated one more step into myself, as if it had closed a door that might never open again. But I moved on, pretending everything was fine. The people around me seemed relieved. The problem was solved. The path was traced. I received compliments for maturity, for understanding, and once again I confused approval with success. Inside, however, something began to fall silent. A part of me that was still trying to exist realized that it was not welcome, and he decided to hide for good. I didn't cry. I didn't complain. I just followed. For a long time, I avoided revisiting that moment. I told myself that there was no alternative, which was the best possible. To question this would require admitting that I had participated in my own erasure. Today, looking back, I see that that decision was a turning point. Not because it changed everything immediately, but because it confirmed something dangerous. I could be molded into even the most important choices, and still remain silent. After that decision that wasn't mine, I realized that something in me slowly started to shut down. I still fulfilled my days, woke up, worked, responded, smiled when expected. On the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, there was a constant sense of distance, as if I was living my own life through thick glass, watching without actually participating. The adaptation, which previously required some conscious effort, started to happen without me noticing. I no longer stopped to think about whether or not I agreed with what they asked me. The yes came before the thought, almost like a reflex trained over the years. Thinking began to tire. Questioning seemed too dangerous for someone who had spent his life avoiding conflict. There was one specific, seemingly ordinary day that stood out from the rest. Not for something big, but just the opposite. It was a simple request, made naturally, as if it was obvious that I would accept. As the person spoke, I felt something different arise inside me. An old, deep discomfort, difficult to explain. That request crossed an invisible boundary that I had been ignoring for years. It was not unfair in the eyes of the speaker. It was not cruel. But when I heard it, I felt a tiredness that did not come from the body. It was an accumulated emotional exhaustion, as if something inside me said that I had gone too far. For a few seconds, I thought about saying no. The word came to form inside me, heavy, strange, almost forbidden. My body reacted before the mind. His heart raced, his hands became cold, and that old anxiety took over. It was the same fear as always, the fear learned at an early age. At that moment, I saw everything that had always held me back cross my mind. The fear of disappointing, the fear of being seen as ungrateful, the possibility of breaking the image of the understanding, the easy, the one that never creates problems. I looked at the face of the person in front of me and recognized the quiet expectation that had always existed. I knew that if I said no, something would change. Maybe the relationship, maybe the weather, maybe the way they saw me. And this possibility paralyzed me more than any direct order. I didn't have to be pressured. I pushed myself into the usual place, the place where I didn't take up space. So I said yes, he said in a controlled, low, rehearsed voice. As the word came out of my mouth, I felt something break inside me. There was no noise, no scene, no visible reaction. It was a silent, deep, definitive break. There, something that still resisted gave up. At that moment, I realized that I was no longer just adapting. I was canceling myself. My wishes were not being postponed until later. They were being discarded, one by one. And the scariest thing was realizing how normal it already seemed to me. After that day, I stopped trying to listen to myself. My opinions stopped arising spontaneously. My answers became neutral, empty, automatic. I functioned well, fulfilled expectations, but I no longer felt presence within me. It was as if I had turned off something essential to continue following. The people around me didn't notice the change. They continued to see me as always, calm, understanding, reliable. I received compliments for my maturity, for his posture, for how easy he was to deal with me. Each compliment sounded like a silent confirmation that I was disappearing without causing discomfort. At night, when everything was quiet, the weight came. It was neither clear sadness nor open revolt. It was a deep emptiness, a feeling of having crossed a point of no return. Today, looking back, I know that was the last warning, the last time there was still choice. After that, I continued to live, but with less and less space inside me. After that moment, life went on as if nothing had happened. That was, perhaps, the strangest part of it all. The world did not stop. No one noticed. No structure fell. The days remained the same, and I continued to fulfill each of them with the same silent efficiency as always. I got married, built a routine, took on responsibilities that seemed natural for someone my age. Everything was happening as it should happen. At least that's what they said. I felt useful, necessary, present, but not entirely. There was always a part of me that was left behind. In marriage, I quickly learned to keep the peace. I avoided arguments, swallowed discomfort, chose my battles so carefully that, in the end, I hardly fought for anything. I confused stability with silence. I thought that to love was not to bother, not to demand, not to take up too much space. The children came, and with them, a new form of disappearance. I started to live to ensure that they lacked nothing. Their needs always came before mine. I told myself that this was being a good father, and maybe it was, but it was also another way to leave myself for last. I worked, returned home, fulfilled schedules, obligations, commitments. My life was functional, organized, correct. On the outside, everything looked solid. Inside, there was a constant feeling of just holding on to something that didn't fully include me. In many moments, I felt a confusion that was difficult to explain. I couldn't tell if I was unhappy because I didn't exactly feel sad. I didn't feel happy either. It was like living in a permanent middle ground where nothing hurt enough to justify change. There was a silent guilt whenever I thought about wanting something different. An internal voice said that I had too much to complain about, that other people had bigger problems. So I would shut up once again, reinforcing the habit that had brought me there. Over the years, I began to feel a tiredness that did not rest. He slept, but woke up tired. He fulfilled tasks, but without enthusiasm. Nothing seemed wrong enough to fix, and nothing seemed certain enough to be lived with pleasure. I became an expert in meeting expectations. I knew exactly what was expected of me in each environment. I adjusted my behavior, my words, my way. I was many acceptable versions, except myself. Sometimes at night, I wondered what it would have been like if I had chosen differently at some point, but he soon pushed that thought away. It seemed too dangerous. Questioning the past would require admitting that I had participated in the construction of that life. The years passed like this, one after the other, without major ruptures. The absence of major tragedies convinced me that all was well. I confused stability with plenitude, and that kept me standing still for a long time. Today, looking back, I realized that that normal life was built on small absences. Each silence reinforced the previous one. Each concession facilitated the next. And without realizing it, I was living a whole life without actually inhabiting it. The life that came after was not a visible mistake. It was an accumulation. And only now do I understand that surviving for so long is not the same as actually living. For many years, I was proud to be needed. People were counting on me. They knew I would be there when they needed me. I solved problems, filled absences, kept everything working. That sense of usefulness gave me a place in the world, even if that place was never exactly mine. Being necessary protected me from something I didn't yet know how to name. While I served, no one asked who I was. While I helped, I didn't have to explain what I felt. I existed through the function I fulfilled, not the person I was. And that seemed enough for a long time. Over the years, I realized that rarely did anyone ask me what I thought. Decisions were made around me, and I was informed afterwards. Not out of malice, but out of habit. I had taught everyone that my opinions were not urgent. When I tried to put myself in, I felt a slight strangeness in the air. People looked at each other as if it was unexpected. They weren't used to me taking up space. And I wasn't either. That made me uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. Being seen requires risk. It requires showing disagreement, will, limit. I had trained my whole life to avoid just that, so I went back to the known role. what it understands, the one who gives in, what adapts. It was easier to stay there than to face the unknown. I realized that they came to me more when they needed something than when they wanted to be with me. Invitations were accompanied by tasks. Conversations arose when there was a problem to solve. I accepted all of this as normal, as part of adult life. There was a quiet weariness about always being available, a wear and tear that could not be claimed because no one forced me. I said yes out of habit, and this habit began to consume me slowly, without fanfare. Sometimes I wondered if anyone really knew me, not the useful version, but the person behind it. I wasn't sure. Maybe I didn't even know it anymore. After all, I spent so much time being what they expected that I lost what I was. When I got sick or needed something, I found it difficult to ask for it. I didn't want to bother. I didn't want to be a weight. This logic was so ingrained that even my needs seemed exaggerated to myself. Being necessary gave me value, but it was a conditioned value. It depended on what I delivered, not what I was. And it started to hurt when I realized that if I stopped, maybe I would disappear. Over time, I came to understand that being seen is different from being useful. Being seen involves presence, listening, recognition, and I rarely had that. Not because I was denied, but because I never claimed. Today, I realize that I hid behind usefulness for fear of rejection. I thought that if it was indispensable, it would never be discarded. But this fear cost me something precious, the chance to be seen for real. Being needed has kept my life going, but it did not fill it. And that's a difference I didn't understand until too late, when the silence began to ask who I really was. The guilt did not come all at once. It was gradually settling in, as something discreet, almost polite. At first, it appeared only when I thought of myself. It was enough for a personal will, a desire for rest or change, for that feeling to come. I felt wrong for wanting more than I already had. I told myself that other people depended on me, that my needs were not a priority. That thinking of me was selfish. This internal discourse was repeated so many times that it no longer seemed like a choice. It has become the rule. I obeyed without question, even when the weight got too big. Shame came right behind, silent and persistent. Shame for not feeling satisfied. Shame for not being able to explain the emptiness I carried. Shame for looking at my life and realizing that even though everything seemed right, something was deeply out of place. I had a hard time even admitting it to myself. After all, I had done everything right. I fulfilled responsibilities. I kept commitments. I didn't abandon anyone. So why this constant sense of lack? This question haunted me, and I did not know how to answer it. There were days when I woke up with an inner confusion that was difficult to explain. Nothing wrong had happened, but everything seemed heavy. I followed the routine, talked, solved problems, but I felt as if I was always behind myself. This confusion accompanied me like a mist. I couldn't identify what I wanted, but I knew that it wasn't exactly what I was experiencing. At the same time, the idea of changing seemed too daunting. It seemed late, it seemed dangerous, it seemed impossible. I often wondered if the problem was me, if I was weak, if he was ungrateful, if he simply did not know how to value what he had. These thoughts hurt me in silence because they reinforced the idea that I had no right to feel this way. When I saw other people taking a stand, complaining or demanding, I felt something strange, a mixture of judgment and envy. I said they exaggerated, but deep down I knew there was something there that I never allowed myself to do, take up space without apologizing. As time went on, I began to doubt my own emotions. Whenever something bothered me, I diminished it. He said it was nothing, that it would pass, that it was a thing of age. This constant denial pushed me further away from myself. There was a contained sadness, but I avoided that name. Sadness seemed too great, too definitive. I preferred to call it tiredness, a bad phase, natural wear and tear. It was easier to accept it that way than to face what it really meant. When someone asked if everything was okay, I automatically answered yes. Not because it was true, but because I didn't know how to explain otherwise. Words never seemed enough. Then I smiled and changed the subject, as I always did. This mixture of guilt, shame, and confusion kept me standing still for many years. I didn't move forward, but I didn't retreat either. He just remained. Today, I understand that these feelings were not defects. They were signs. But at that time, I still didn't know how to listen to them. The body was the first to realize what I spent years ignoring. Before I even had the courage to admit anything, he began to react. A constant tiredness, which did not improve with rest. I slept, but I woke up as if I hadn't slept. Something in me never seemed to shut down completely. At first, I treated it as part of age. He said that it was normal to slow down, to feel the weight of the years. I accepted this explanation easily because it did not require change. It was comfortable to blame time instead of looking at life itself, but the signs became more frequent. I woke up with a heavy body, as if carrying myself was an effort. Small tasks seemed too big. It was not sharp pain, nor something that could be clearly pointed out. It was a silent wear, spread over everything. There were days when I would sit and stand there not knowing exactly why. It wasn't laziness. It was a lack of energy to continue pretending normality. Even so, I got up and followed. I always followed. This has also become a habit. I began to notice that my body reacted before me. In certain situations, the chest tightened, breathing shortened, tension took over. I didn't understand why, but I did. Still, I didn't know it. Pretending I didn't feel it was always my finest talent. People around commented that I seemed quieter. I replied that I was just tired. And it was true, but not all. The fatigue came from carrying a lifetime of silences, of limits never imposed, of wills never expressed. I avoided talking about it because I didn't know how to explain it. How can you say that the body was tired of a life that functioned but did not feed? How could he admit that he was not only physical, without seeming ungrateful or weak? So I remained silent. There were nights when sleep did not come. I would lie there, staring into the dark, feeling the weight of everything that was never said. Old thoughts came back without warning. Small moments, forgotten choices, accumulated concessions. My body seemed to remember everything. During the day, I continued to work. It always worked, but something had changed. I no longer felt whole, not even on automatic. The effort to maintain the routine began to become visible, at least for me. In quick consultations, I heard generic explanations: stress, age, routine. I accepted them all because none required me to look deeper. It was easier to treat the effects than to face the cause. Deep down, I knew the body was saying something I'd avoided hearing for decades. He spoke the language I couldn't speak. He spoke through fatigue, tension, lack of enthusiasm. He spoke because I didn't. Still, it took me time to put the pieces together. I kept going, believing that it was enough to hold on a little longer. I always put up with it. But something in me was beginning to understand that the body wasn't failing. He was reacting. Today, looking back, I see that this was the beginning of the end of a resistance that was too long. My body started to speak when I no longer had the strength to silence everything. And for the first time, I began to suspect that perhaps the problem was never weakness, but too much silence. Over the years, the house began to become quiet in a way I had never experienced before. It was not the protective silence of childhood, nor the functional silence of a house full of tasks. It was a wide silence which seemed to spread through the rooms and settle in the empty spaces. A silence that did not disappear with the television on. The children grew up, followed their own paths, as it was natural to happen. I saw them less and less, spoke less, participated less in their daily lives. There were no fights, no sudden withdrawals, just a calm, almost polite distance, which I accepted without question, as I always did. The routine slowed down, and the days started to look too much like each other. I woke up, did small tasks, sat down, got up, sat down again. Time has gained a strange rhythm, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow. Always silent, always the same. I started to notice sounds that didn't catch my attention before. The clock marking the hours insistently, the noise of the refrigerator turning on and off, the wind beating against the window on colder days. Each sound seemed to occupy a space that was previously filled with voices and urgencies. It was in this silence that I began to revisit the past more often, not just out of nostalgia, but because the present seemed too empty to occupy my thoughts. Memories arose without warning, bringing simple scenes, words said halfway, choices that were suspended in time. I remembered paths I didn't follow, opportunities I missed without realizing it. These memories did not come as direct accusations. They came as silent questions, difficult to answer, questions I've spent my whole life avoiding. Walking around the house, I sometimes had the strange feeling of not completely belonging in that space, as if I had lived there out of obligation, not out of true presence. Each corner kept a version of me that no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed in its entirety. There were afternoons when I would just sit and stare at nothing. It was not clear sadness, nor despair. It was a suspension, too long a gap between who I was and who I could still be. The silence made everything more evident. I tried to fill the time with small distractions, repeated programs, interrupted readings, tasks done unwillingly. Nothing could completely silence that feeling of absence. The silence always returned, more insistent, deeper. I began to realize that all my life, the external noise had protected me from myself. Work, commitments, responsibilities. Now without that, I was forced to live with what was left, and what was left seemed little. The house was not only empty of people, I was empty of myself. This realization hurt more than I expected, because it meant that I was absent even in the moments when I was physically present. It was in this excessive silence that something began to move inside me, a slow, almost timid restlessness, as if an ancient truth was trying to find space to emerge after decades of suffocation. I still didn't know what was going to come next, but I began to understand that the silence of the house was not the enemy. It just revealed everything I'd spent my whole life trying not to hear. The moment that changed everything did not come with noise. It was not a dramatic revelation, nor an intense discussion. It came about in a simple, almost banal way, like so many other important things in my life. And maybe that's why it crossed me so deeply. I was talking to someone close, an ordinary conversation, without great expectations. We talked about practical things, everyday life, light subjects. At a certain point, this person said something without thinking too much, as if commenting on the obvious. A short, direct sentence, said without intention to hurt. When I heard those words, I felt as if time had slowed down. My body reacted before I could organize any thoughts. A tightness in the chest, a strange feeling of emptiness and clarity at the same time. Something inside me recognized that phrase as true before I even understood it. The phrase was simple. We never knew what you wanted. There was no charge in it. There was no guilt, just observation. And that's what hurt the most. Because at that moment, I realized that that person was right. No one ever knew, and I was the main responsible for that. I was silent for a few seconds, trying to find an answer, any answer, but I didn't find it. Not because he didn't want to talk, but because he didn't know what to say. The implicit question, what did you want? It echoed inside me in an uncomfortable way. At that moment, I understood something that took me decades to see. I was not ignored. I became invisible little by little. I taught people not to ask me. I showed, with each concession, that my wishes did not matter. And they learned. This realization was accompanied by a silent pain, but also by something new. For the first time, I considered the possibility that maybe it wasn't my fault. Maybe I wasn't weak. Maybe I had been conditioned to disappear in order to survive. The memories began to reorganize themselves inside me. Old situations have gained a new meaning, phrases I've heard in the past, attitudes I've accepted, choices I haven't made. Everything started to make sense in a new light, less cruel to myself. I felt a strange grief at that moment, not only for what I have lived, but for what I have never lived, for the person he could have been if he had learned, from an early age, that he had the right to space. This grief was accompanied by deep sadness, but also relief. The relief of finally naming something that has always been there. The relief of understanding that that emptiness was not a defect, nor ingratitude, nor weakness. It was a consequence of a lifetime lived for the sake of others. I didn't cry at that moment. I just kept quiet, taking it all in, but something inside me moved. An old rigidity began to give way. For the first time, I considered that perhaps there was still time to exist in another way, even if it was late. The phrase continued to echo in the following days. We never knew what you wanted. And little by little, another question began to arise, even more difficult. Did I know? Did I really know what I wanted? Or had I spent too much time in silence to recognize it? That was the beginning of the awakening. Not a noisy awakening, but a firm one. A simple truth, said unintentionally, opened a huge crack inside me. And for the first time in a long time, this crack let in something other than silence. What comes now is the hardest part for me to tell. Saying it out loud means letting go of the silence that has protected me for decades, even though I know how much it cost me. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths don't ask for spectacle. They ask for courage. Therefore, I ask you, subscribe, not as a support for me, but as a gesture so that voices like this are not erased when they finally decide to exist. After that sentence, I spent days in silence, but it was not the same silence that accompanied me throughout my life. There was something different going on inside me, as if old pieces were starting to move. I was no longer just remembering the past. I was reinterpreting everything in a new, harsher, more honest light. Situations that have always seemed normal to me began to take on another meaning. Small demands, constant expectations, decisions made without me being consulted. All of this always came wrapped up in beautiful words, justified as care, responsibility, or love. And I accepted, because it seemed like the right way to belong. For decades, I believed that to love was to give in, that being loved meant adapting. The more I molded myself, the safer I would be within relationships. This idea guided my choices without me realizing it. Today I see how much she trapped me. There were no screams or evident scenes that justified revolt. There was no easy thing to point out as wrong. What existed was control disguised as protection, silence treated as maturity, submission confused with virtue. And that's what makes it all so hard to understand. The most painful thing was to admit that I myself defended this system for years. I explained, justified, minimized. He said that it was just like that every family worked that way, that there was no reason to question. Recognizing this required facing how much I participated in my own erasure. I began to see that many of my choices were not born of desire, but of fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of losing ties, fear of being seen as a problem. This fear guided my life silently, steadily, and efficiently. When this perception set in, I felt angry. Not an explosive rage, but a deep one. Anger for not having realized before, for having accepted so much, for having confused survival with virtue. This anger hurt, but it also woke up something that was dormant. Soon after came the mourning, a different grief, difficult to explain. It was not only for the past, but for the future that never existed. For the person I could have been if I had learned from an early age that I had the right to space, opinion, and self-desire. This grief was not dramatic. It was silent, heavy, tired. I felt like I was burying a version of myself that never had a chance to live. And accepting this required an honesty that I never practiced with myself. At the same time, something new slowly began to emerge. A belated understanding, but liberating. I wasn't weak. I was conditioned. I was not indifferent to my own life. I learned to always put it on the back burner to survive emotionally. This understanding did not erase the pain, but it changed the way I saw myself. For the first time, I was able to look at myself without contempt, with a little compassion. I did what I knew how to do with the tools I had at that moment. Realizing that it wasn't love but control was like lifting an old weight from your chest, a weight that I carried thinking it was part of me. In fact, it never did. It was something imposed, repeated, normalized, and accepted for lack of an alternative. After this truth, there was no way to pretend anymore. I couldn't go back to the previous state knowing what I now knew. Something needed to change. Maybe not everything. Maybe not all at once. But for the first time, I understood that staying the same meant disappearing for good. After understanding that it was not love, but control, came an emptiness unlike anything I had ever felt. It was not confusion, nor guilt, nor shame. It was mourning. A silent, deep mourning, difficult to explain. I wasn't losing someone. I was losing a life that never came into existence. I started to look at the past with a clarity that hurt. Every choice made out of fear now appeared as an ignored fork. Paths I didn't follow, words I didn't say, decisions I left in the hands of others. All of this formed a parallel story that was never lived. This grief did not come with easy tears. He came tired, a weight on the chest when he wakes up, a constant feeling of delay, as if I had arrived too late to the meeting with myself. I wondered how many versions of me fell by the wayside. There were times when I felt angry at time, anger at not being able to return, for not being able to correct, for not being able to experience certain things with the energy that only youth allows. This anger soon turned to sadness, because there was no one to blame directly. I also felt jealous. Envy of people who allowed themselves to make mistakes, to try, to change, people who took up space without apologizing. This envy was accompanied by shame, because I thought I no longer had that right. I began to regret small things. Conversations I never had, simple decisions that I always left for later, desires that I ignored because they seemed inconvenient. I realized that it was not only big dreams that I lost, but also small joys. This grief was lonely. There were no rituals, no external recognition. No one knew that I was burying an entire life that only existed inside me. On the outside, I remained the same. Inside, something was being fired. At times, I thought that this weight was going to crush me. That understanding all this too late was too cruel. I even wondered if it wouldn't have been better to continue without knowing. But the truth had already set in, and there was no turning back. Over time, I began to realize that this grief also carried something unexpected. Along with the pain was a strange sense of honesty. For the first time, I wasn't lying to myself about who I was or what I lost. I allowed myself to feel that grief without trying to fix it. I didn't try to turn it into a lesson quickly. I just felt it. I respected the pain of recognizing that I lived less than I could, even though I had survived for so long. I understood that this grief was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of conscience. Awareness of someone who finally saw himself after decades of living to fit in others. And that, while painful, was also a kind of awakening. As I accepted this grief, something began to reorganize itself within me. Not as a promise of a great new beginning, but as a silent possibility. Maybe I couldn't live through everything I lost, but maybe I could still live something true. The mourning for the life I didn't live didn't destroy me. He emptied me. And in this emptying, he made room for something new. Small, late, but finally mine. After accepting the grief for the life I didn't live, something inside me slowly began to reorganize. It was not a clear decision, nor a moment of sudden courage. It was more like a constant annoyance, a lingering feeling that continuing the same way meant disappearing for good. I didn't know how to change yet, but I knew I couldn't annul myself anymore. The first change was not external, it was internal. I started to notice when something bothered me, even if it was small. Before, this discomfort was quickly muffled, pushed down from old justifications. Now I allowed him to exist for a few seconds longer. That alone was new to me. I started to pay attention to how I spoke, how many times he apologized unnecessarily. Apologies for taking up time, for giving opinions, for simply being there. Gradually, I tried to stop this habit. Each time I was less silent, my body reacted with tension, as if I were breaking an invisible rule. Saying no was one of the hardest steps I've ever taken. Not an aggressive no, nor a no full of explanations. Just a simple, straightforward limit. The first time, my heart raced as if something very bad was going to happen, but nothing happened. Silence came, and then life went on. That moment marked me deeply, because I realized that the danger I felt was not in the present, but in the past. It was an old fear, learned early, that no longer matched who I was now. Even so, facing him required more courage than I imagined. I noticed that some people were surprised by my change, some were confused, others showed mild discomfort. I understood with some regret that they were used to my absence of limits. And for the first time, I accepted that this discomfort was not my responsibility. Occupying space did not mean confronting anyone or rewriting the past. It meant something quieter and more difficult. Choosing small things for me, giving their opinion when asked, stay in a conversation without backing down, to sustain my presence even when my voice trembled. There were times when guilt tried to pull me back. That old feeling of selfishness, of exaggerating, of thinking too much about myself. But now I recognize that guilt. I knew where it came from. And even though I was afraid, I chose not to obey automatically. I understood that occupying space was not taking away anyone's space. It was just existing with integrity. It was to allow my wills to have the same value as those of others, something that I was never taught, but that I was finally beginning to learn. This change did not bring me immediate happiness. He brought something more solid and more real, presence. For the first time, I felt like I was inside my own life, even though I didn't know exactly how to live it yet. Some ties changed with this. Some have become more distant. Others adjusted unexpectedly. There were also those who approached it differently, perhaps because they were now dealing with someone more whole. I accepted these changes without trying to control them. The most important thing was to realize that I no longer needed to justify myself all the time. I didn't need to explain why I wanted something different. I could just want to. This realization, so simple, was one of the most difficult of my life. Taking up space for the first time was uncomfortable, tiring, and scary. But he was also honest. For the first time, I wasn't trying to please everyone. I was trying, finally, not to abandon myself again. Today, when I look back, I don't just see a life of mistakes or losses. I see a life of survival. I survived the way I knew how, with the tools I had, in the conditions I was given. It took me a while to understand this, but understanding changes everything, because it transforms guilt into context and shame into conscience. I spent decades believing that disappearing was a way to love, that giving in was a virtue, that occupying little space was a sign of maturity. These ideas were taught to me early, repeated many times, until they seemed to be absolute truths. Questioning them now doesn't change the past, but it does change the way I see myself. There are things I'll never recover. Time, choices, versions of me that fell by the wayside. Accepting this hurts. It still hurts, but it doesn't hurt like before. Now it's a clean, honest pain, without that layer of self-accusation that has accompanied me for so long. I understood that there is no right age to notice one's absence. There is only the moment when the truth ceases to fit into silence. For me, this moment came late, but it came in one piece. And that makes a difference. Because arriving in one piece, even late, is still arriving. Today, my changes are small. I didn't turn my life into something great. I didn't rewrite everything, but I make more conscious choices. I say no when I need to. I say yes when I want. And above all, I listen to what I feel before I automatically adapt. Some people were surprised. Others have moved away. Some approached differently. I accepted all of this as part of the process. I learned that it is not possible to occupy space without rearranging the surroundings. And this is not selfishness. It is a consequence. I still feel afraid. I still feel guilty sometimes. These feelings didn't magically disappear, but now they don't boss me around anymore. I recognize them, I observe them, and I follow them anyway. This was perhaps the biggest change of all. If I could talk to who I went to, I wouldn't say it was different. I would only say that it was not weakness. It was survival. And surviving for so long is also a form of strength, even if silent, even if invisible. I learned that some truths wait a lifetime to be told. They hide in silence, in routine, in apparent normality. But when they finally find space, they transform everything, even if they don't change the world around them. Today, I don't seek to make up for what I lost. I seek to live what is still possible with honesty. Small, simple, real. Not to prove anything to anyone, but not to continue cheating on myself. If you who listen to this story feel something similar, know this. Realizing it late does not cancel out what matters. Understanding now still matters. The space you begin to occupy today is still space, and that changes everything inside. I spent decades adapting until there was almost no space left, but the little that remained was enough for something essential. To exist, to recognize myself, to say finally that even late, it still matters. If any part of this story touched you, please share this video. Not as something personal, but because what was experienced here reveals silent patterns that still shape many lives. Maybe there's someone around you who needs to hear that right now, and sharing it could be the gesture that breaks an old silence. I'm going to stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching this, and what about this story stayed with you? Your words don't sit in the void, they actually reach me.